The title of our episode on the 15th of October 2017, the Crimson Tide State. I'll get that right in a minute here. This is where the Bear Bryant, once ran, down in Tuscaloosa at the University of Alabama. Now we have, interestingly enough, a Senate contest going on between Judge Roy Moore, the Christian evangelistic type that spoke at the Values Summit, and Doug Jones, a former U.S. attorney, a man that prosecuted Klansmen, the Klansmen that painted the night red in Birmingham, which was known as Bumingham, Alabama. Mr. Jones is running from behind. Let's go to this piece we have on Alabama, the Crimson Tide State. We'll just start here with the polling. Poll says Roy Moore still leads, strong leads, signs of life for Democrats, and I'm sure there. Nice picture of Judge Moore and Doug Jones. A wide-ranging poll conducted by an Alabama firm indicates Republican Moore is still holding a strong lead in the Senate race. At the same time, Doug Jones is polling well enough to show signs of life for the Democratic Party in a deeply red state, the poll memo said. Governor Ivey, Kay Ivey, received indications of strong support in her bid for governor next year. She was a lieutenant governor, she replaced the corrupt governor that was forced to resign there in Alabama. Nonetheless, the signer poll, I guess that's how you pronounce it, was landlines, mobile phones, the 2nd through the 5th of October, polling 497 for the general election, a margin of error of 4.4% there. It's the first sign-up poll that has been conducted since July, in which at least 90% of the participants said they were definitely going to vote on December the 12th. Moore holds an 8-point lead over Jones in the poll released exactly 2 months before the election. Moore got support from 49% of the participants to Jones' 41%. That's consistent with 2 other polls released during the general election, but Moore's lead was from 6 to 8%. Well, you have a margin of error there. Do we look to the margin of error? Will Judge Moore overperform? Well, it's consistent he could. Name recognition is an issue for Jones. Jones is not very well known. 18% of the polling participants said they'd never heard of Jones, the former U.S. attorney who successfully prosecuted 2 men in the 1963 bombing in Birmingham that killed the 4 little girls. Jones has a 5-point lead among polling participants age 18 to 49 and would make up 27% of the projected electorate. Voters 50 and older, however, favor Moore by 12 points. That would be obvious there. Moore is polling strongest in his market in Birmingham, but not much. By 46 to 45, if he is to win this, he's going to have to get a very, very strong turnout in the cities of Alabama. In other major markets around the state, Jones holds a 14-point lead. His strongest lead among large and medium markets is in Mobile. That's 57 to 36. The poll said 51% of the participants, and this is where the Crimson Tide comes in, identify as Alabama Crimson Tide fans. 22% for the Auburn Tigers. Moore graduated from Alabama. Makes a difference there. The Auburn people are seen as a country folk in primarily a rural state. Judge Moore's manifest destiny to fill Alabama's vacant Senate seat hasn't shown any signs of slowing down in the general election environment, the poll memo said, fueled by strong combination support from fans of his alma mater and low name ID for Mr. Jones. So he's out to an 8-point lead. Fortunately for Mr. Jones, he has until December, 2 months to make up for that. Despite Moore's seemingly grip on the Senate race, Jones 41% support in a crimson red state shows signs of life for the Democratic campaign. It is a sign of life indeed there. Incidentally, I'm working from the Birmingham newspaper here. I want everybody to know that. Auburn's miracle in 2013 defeat of Alabama by returning a missed field goal 100 yards, known as Kick Six, to demonstrate the state's race. Well, no doubt Bear Bryant is looking down on this one. As for every survey, final results will be determined by the turnout. The results of the survey indicate that a low turnout bodes well for Mr. Moore. It always does, because he is better known. Meanwhile, expect this race to heat up significantly as we move into November. There's been some controversy over a fund payout to Judge Moore. On the victory stage, any scenario short of this notorious Kick Six turnaround will have more on the victory stage in December. Polls also indicate participants about his views on Ivy because she, after Bentley, that was a corrupt governor, was forced to resign. The poll participants give Ivy a 65% favorable rating, higher than 58% for DJ Trump and 53% for Moore. Now, Jones has a 43%. A lot of that is Mr. Jones is not known. Now, this is from Matt Hubble, Vice President of Research and Analytics. Survey of general election voters in Alabama. It's dated on Thursday the 12th. The results, this is the first survey since July, identifying voting percentages. Roy Moore, 8 points by 8 points overall. Jones leads Moore by 5 points among voters 18 to 49. And 27%, let me just get this lined up a little bit better here, of the projected turnout, while Moore has a commanding lead, 12% with 50 and older. Jones suffers obviously from name ID. 18% of the voters polled have never heard of Doug Jones. That's not unusual, because Doug Jones prosecuted that case a few years back involving the Klansman. The present governor, Ivy, is favorable. That we already got that, 65%, a good favorable rating there. 51% of special general election voters identify as fans of the Crimson Tide, while only 22% for the Auburn Tigers. Of course, Moore has higher support than Jones amongst Alabamans. Both Alabama 54 to 38 and Auburn 50 to 45. That's kind of interesting. Auburn is the country people, but it's much closer there. Of course, Moore came from the University of Alabama, which would mean a lot for Moore. Moore is 70 years old. A matchup there. 53 to 38%. European females break for Moore. 46 to 45 is the vote for 35 to 49-year-olds. Jones at 43 to 45 for Moore. 20% of the higher propensity to vote, high propensity to vote in December. Moore leads by 14 points. Among votes with the highest propensity, that would be older voters would turn out. Moore leads Jones amongst married voters by 25 points, 57 to 32. Among voters that usually support Republican candidates, 13% say they will definitely support Doug Jones. Likewise, 8% of Democrat voters will definitely support Roy Moore. That's not very good right there. If we break it down, the cities here, the major cities in Alabama, in Huntsville, 20% of the voters, 52 to 39 for Jones. In Birmingham, and that is 41% of the voters. There's a 1-point difference there, 46 to 45. Jones just by a point. Jones has to do much, much, much better in Birmingham. In Montgomery, that's their capital, 25% of the voters, 50% for Moore, 39% for Jones. In Mobile, I suppose, 14% of the voters, 57% for Moore, 36% for Mr. Jones. And if we look overall favorables here, ratings, Roy Moore at 52.9, very favorable at 35. That is a 1.4 ratio there. And to Doug Jones, he's at 42.7, and 31% are very favorable for him. Kay Ivey, we talked about her before. She's at 65%. DJ Trump at 57.8, one of the higher approval ratings for DJ Trump. Moore's manifest destiny to fill the Senate seat hasn't shown any sign of letting up. This is the memo I read from parts of it before. Despite seemingly grip on the Senate, Moore has 41% of the vote. Jones, The methodology here of this one, a fairly old poll. It was conducted October 2nd through the 5th with participation of 49% of, participation by 497 for the special election. Margin of error here is plus or minus 4.4%. Mr. Jones would hope that he is in the margin of error. And this Sino, let me start over here again. CYGNAL firm is a research and communication firm serving right of center committees, organizations, and consultants. They have worked with 150 clients, conducted more than 300 accurate polls there, what they claim to have done. And this is basically where they are. So in other words, this is a right of center polling firm. Mr. Jones will no doubt do better with some other polling firms, and we can assume. All right, let's go back to it. This is also from Alabama.com. Doug Jones could win and why he won't. This is by Elizabeth Beshears. Nomination of former Judge Moore to the Republican race 2 weeks ago. The state remaining Democrats begin to rub their hands together conspiratorially, eager to begin taking an arguable, the least popular candidate, taking on the least popular Republican candidate. There, this was incidentally on the 9th. It was updated on the 11th. That's just a few days ago. It was all set up for them. Doug Jones, with his reputation for high morals, generally likable against a man who has twice been removed from office, who garners less than 52% of the statewide vote in 2012. Well, this time around, according to that right-wing survey there, he's garnering about 49% of the vote. So unfortunately for Alabama, Moore's 2 removes for office were probably the less embarrassing footnote for a long political career full of PR stunts. extra biblical morality stances, shady business deals with his ironically named foundation, and questionable judicial decisions. A history of making opportunities was handed to the National and Alabama Democrats on the silver platter. On the last day, Jones should have been doubling down on how moderate of a Democrat he was. He insisted on publishing a picture of himself with Planned Parenthood. Not a good idea, Mr. Jones. And then he got on MSNBC. That is okay, but talking about how pro-life only after the baby is born. Well, allowing his position to be interpreted in support of late-term abortions, and yet he doesn't support. He is on record as supporting a repeal of the Hyde Amendment. That was named after old Hyde, who has turned out to be the poster boy for immorality. He's in jail now. Anyway, the stance which Jones has not rebuffed or clarified is one almost none of the even more moderate Republicans can get behind. And not very smart there. He needs to run a better campaign. Alabama's Republican Party chair, Terry Latham, said Planned Parenthood is more than welcome to come campaign for Jones in a yellow jacket state. So the yellow hammer state, sorry about that, should be jacket, but anyway, hammer state, I guess they'd hammer Jones. If they were yellow jackets, they would sting him. Framing the entire election around a single topic of abortion boxes out of so many other issues, there is a more stark of a dividing line between Democrats and Republicans than this sensitive topic. This is a good article here. It's worth noting that Jones' position on abortion falls outside of mainstream Alabama Democrats as well. Not good for him. Put simply, Moore is not a strong Republican candidate. Jones simply can't make the math. Well, yeah. By my back-of-the-envelope calculation, there's between 45,000 and 90,000 Alabamans who usually vote Republican who will need to flip to the other side of the aisle. The real problem is in 90,000 moderate Republicans who simply can't stand Roy Moore, prioritize their distaste for Moore over their pro-life beliefs. Dozens of Republicans, mostly young ones with whom I have shared my frustration over Alabama's recent Republican candidates, have reached out to me to say they are secretly going to cast their ballot for Jones, but I'm not convinced even millenniums who vote Republican voting for Jones will not be enough to tip the scale. No doubt about that. According to the Pew Research, I was talking to a right-winger the other day and brought up Pew. 58% of Alabamans believe abortion should be illegal or in all or most cases. 37% believe it should be legal in all or most cases. Well, I'm surprised it's not 90%. Because of this polling, the general population has a strong likelihood loyal Republican voters will hold their views even at a higher rate. As pointed out by John Sharp, Democratic congressional leaders have been willing to overlook pro-life stances from members in red and purple states. But Mr. Jones is already in the box, so he can't change himself, nor does Judge Moore want to. How much the scandal with Moore's religious foundation will hammer in, or will they forgive old Judge as long as he builds his statues, various ones. He had a Ten Commandments statue. It'd be taller than the World Trade Center. So that's basically the way Mr. Moore goes. This is from Business Insider. It's basically the same thing. Moore said he had talked with old man McConnell after defeating the incumbent senator. That was Luther Strangelove. At the Value Voters Summit, he was there. Said he had spoken with McConnell once, telling him it would be a hard campaign. Moore's aides then got testy with reporters and barred further questions before exiting the event. A spokesman for McConnell claimed they did talk. Moore routinely cites McConnell as the primary foe and obstruction to a more conservative agenda. How conservative he wants to be. He told Newsmax, that's a right-wing outlet, that he would not back McConnell as the majority leader if he had a vote in the Senate. He's repeatedly let down the president for his agenda, he says, and toughening immigration laws, getting tax reform on the road to passage. McConnell has been the man behind all of those schemes. Meanwhile, McConnell endorsed Moore following his victory over Luther Strangelove, who was backed by the majority leader, and DJ Trump. Of course, DJ Trump took that back. This is Alabama, not New York or California. That's what Chris Pack told Alabama.com. Democrats first need to demonstrate this is an actual race before everything is considered. Moore has been one of the more controversial figures. We don't have to go into that. He has, but what he said is not very different from what DJ Trump has said himself. Now, this is a state that literally, and we'll talk about pulling To Kill a Mockingbird from school reading lists, criticism there. So you can see a decision by the Mississippi School District to pull To Kill a Mockingbird from a junior high school reading list, and drawing widespread ridicule from both Republicans and Democrats. The 1960 Pulitzer Prize winning novel by Alabama neighbor Harper Lee. Harper Lee was a brilliant writer, including language that makes people uncomfortable. That's according to the district in Biloxi, Mississippi. It deals with racial inequality in a small Alabama town. The Biloxi Sun-Herald first reported on Thursday that the school board's decision and when Duncan received a tweet about the Chicago teachers seeking 80 copies of the book. The Teachers Project posted a choice.org was fully funded at $500 and something. Anyway, that's To Kill a Mockingbird. That was on the 14th of October at Alabama.com. But this is much, much more important in Alabama. It shows how voter suppression works there. Too poor to vote. Alabama's new poll tax bars thousands of people from voting. And this is what the Republican Party has been able to do in Alabama and other states. Here's what the scheme is. 9 years after she was convicted of fraud using a credit card, Randy Lynn Williams is unable to vote because she owes $9,000 in fees, fines, and restitution. Ms. Williams assumes she will never be able to vote again. The 38-year-old Dorfam, I hope I'm pronouncing that, lost her right to vote in 2008 when she was convicted of fraudulent use of a credit card. She was on probation for 2 years and served a few months behind bars, ending in early 2011, at which point she had been eligible to vote, would have been in most states. In Maine and Vermont, she would have never lost the right. In fact, in the first place, you can vote from the jailhouse in those states. But in Alabama and 8 other states, from Nevada to Tennessee, people who have lost the franchise cannot regain it until they pay off any outstanding court fees, legal fees, and victim restitution. So in other words, OJ wouldn't be able to vote in those states. In Alabama, required has fostered an underclass of thousands of people who are unable to vote because they do not have enough money. Folks like Williams, who said she regularly voted prior to the conviction, remains an obstacle for participation. The poll tax in the extreme Alabama's felon disenfranchisement policies are likely unconstitutional. They have desperate impacts on felons who are poor, African Americans, or both. In 1964, the 24th Amendment abolished the poll tax, but to this day, Alabama money keeps thousands from voting. According to the Sentencing Project, that's based in Washington, D.C., criminal justice reform nonprofit, there are 286,666 disenfranchised felons in Alabama. Now that is 7.62% of the voting age population. More than half of those disenfranchised are African Americans, despite the fact that African Americans make up only 26.8% of the population. That is of July 2016. A new state law has cleared the way for people convicted of certain felonies to eventually regain the right to vote, but before they can, anyone who's lost their franchise in Alabama for any reason must fulfill any financial obligations to their victim. That's according to Secretary of State John Merle. In order to have your voting rights restored, you have to make sure all fines and restitution is made. Researchers at the University of Pennsylvania, Harvard, and Yale crunched reams of Alabama court records and data for the past 2 decades and established a study published in June. The research paper stated that a majority of all ex-felons in Alabama, white, black, or otherwise, cannot vote because of debts they owe to the state. Scott Douglas, he's executive director of the Greater Birmingham Ministries, said such widespread disenfranchisement amounts to a poll tax in the extreme. It is absolutely horrible, no doubt about that. It's a financial burden to vote, and once again, people are at least able to pay it. It's like a poll tax that bars that, and no doubt about that. So Williams doesn't believe she'll ever be able to vote there. Williams' only source of income is a disability check, $772 each month from Social Security. She had never been charged with a violent crime, yet Williams is saddled with fines and fees, debt known as legal financial obligations, $11,050, $500 as a result of the credit card fraud conviction. Only $46,000 of that obligation is restitution to the victim of a crime. So it's less than half. 6 years later, Williams, a European woman who owns thousands more in connection with multiple other felony convictions over the past 2 decades, still owes $9,000 for 2011 conviction alone. Such financial barriers amount to unconstitutional poll tax that discriminates against individuals on the basis of wealth. That's according to Randall Marshall, executive director of the Alabama ACLU. And so it goes on. In May, Ivey signed a law called the Definition of Moral Turpitude Act that advocates hope would lead to advocates a large number of felons across the state becoming eligible to restore their rights to vote. The law, which went into effect in August, creates a list of crimes of moral turpitude, felonies that result in automatic disenfranchisement of anyone who is convicted of one. Before the law was passed, determination of which crimes considered moral turpitude were made on a case-by-case basis. The definition of moral turpitude eliminates the slapdash system, and consequences. Many felons who previously lost their right to vote were deemed to have committed crimes minor enough shouldn't result in the consequence. The policy requires them to first pay off all legal fees. The same old scam. Tam Williams, organizing director of the Greater Birmingham Ministries, works with felons across the state to help to try them to restore their voting rights. She says that she has encountered a number of people who have only been convicted of crimes not considered of moral turpitude under the new law. So in 1970, the Supreme Court ruled in Williams v. Illinois that courts must take a defendant's ability to pay, whether or not the defendant is indigent, into account when imposing punishment for non-payment of fees. The Alabama rules of criminal procedure say that when courts in the state decide whether or not to impose a fine in a criminal case, they must consider the financial resource and obligation of the defendant. It's very similar in the civil side. That was discussed in the civil trial of Orenfeld James Simpson, where O.J. was put in a position of a civil judgment of $33 million, which he could never pay. That is not, the judge usually eliminates those kinds of verdicts. The attorneys and advocates and academics say judges in Alabama appear to be ignoring or disregarding that guidance. Now, in court, the state decides whether or not to impose a fine on a criminal case. They should consider the financial resource, the ability of the defendant to pay the fine. So if the defendant can't pay the fine in the first place, there is no reason to impose it. Policies like Alabama, which distinguish amongst defendants based on wealth, may also pay insufficient attention to indigency. That is from a study by the Journal of Legal Studies states. The authors looked at whether or not a felon was represented by a public defender as a proxy for identifying less wealthy clients. It found that a strong and statistical significant correlation between the probabilities of having an outstanding legal financial obligation balance and the use of the public defender suggests that the current policy may be disenfranchising a number of people who can't afford it rather than refuse to buy back their right to vote. They can't do it. Researchers looked at more than 1,000 felons in Alabama who had completed any prison terms and periods of probation or parole to which they had been sentenced. They found that 75% of those still owed legal obligations. So the Jim Crow 2 here, the 280,000 disenfranchised felons in Alabama, 143,924 African Americans. That's according to the Sentencing Project. That means disenfranchised felons make up 15.11% of the state's voting African American population. African American felons are 9.4% less likely to be eligible to vote in Alabama because of outstanding fees and fines. We find that African American defendants are significantly more likely to be ineligible to restore their voting rights due to legal fine obligations. That's where racism moves in there. Mr. Duell Ross, Assistant Counsel for the NAACP Defense and Education Fund in New York, says the fact that Alabama links voting rights to the ability to pay has a desperate impact on African American felons and indirectly suppress the vote of African Americans who are not felons, no doubt. You see large numbers of African Americans being unable to vote, he says, and the idea of the community contagion, the way it has been used before by the legal defense funds describe an idea that once has a large percentage of the population, 10 to 15%, being unable to vote because of felon disenfranchisement laws. It begins to impact the larger population. Kamel Owen said he considers the idea that someone could be barred from voting simply because they can't afford to pay off their fines, a restitution to be the epicenter of disenfranchisement. Convicted first of armed robbery in 2007, he was released on parole in 2015 after serving 8 years on a 35-year prison sentence. The African-American Birmingham resident, who is now an advocate for felon rights, is not eligible to vote until 2042 unless he receives a full pardon and pays his legal fees. The right to vote should never be tied to the level of one's debt, he said, and the moral issue, if you want people to come back and transition back into society, one of the fundamental tenets of society is the right to be able to vote. Now, this story was also published in The Guardian, the U.S. edition here. Very good story. That's why we read it almost verbatim. Too poor to vote, how Alabama's new poll tax bars thousands. It was on the 6th of October. It was updated on the 6th from the 4th, and by Connor Shields of Alabama.com. Very, very good article here. Now let's move on to the sport. The Chicago Cubs in Los Angeles lost the game 1 to the Dodgers. And let's get to that score now. The day was not full of, as they say, a lot of things to write home about. And here we go. The Cubs, sorry about that. It was 5-2. Dodgers 5. The Cubs were 2 in that one. And in the American League game, now it's Astros are 2 up on the Yankees. Astros are 2-1. And tonight, also 2-1 over the Yankees. Well pitched games, no doubt about that. Let's see, we do get at least a line score here. The Yanks
My
had
fellow
1
Vikings,
run and 5.
Now is the time to don our purple garb and golden.
Had where are we? 1 run, 5 hits, and no errors. And Houston had 2 runs and 5 hits and no errors there. So we do have a complete line score here. Let's see what we had. Houston got their first hit in the 4th. And New York in the 5th. They had a hit in the 5th. And it moved on. And actually in the 9th, Houston got their second run. So there we go. 1-2 was the score there. And we cluck back here. And it was the same last night. The exception was that this time around, they had Mr. Chapman in there. And they got a run off of Mr. Chapman in the 9th. And to the LA Chicago game, the line score here. We'll get it in a minute here. The Chicago had 2 runs, 4 hits, no errors. And the Dodgers had 5 runs and 8 hits and no errors there. So it was Chicago got their 2 runs in the 4th. And LA in the 5th got 2 runs, 1 run in the 6th, 2 in the 7th. And that's how they got their 5 runs together. There, the winner was Medina, and the loser was Hector Randon. And Kenley Jansen got the save, and that was the end of that story right there. And let's see, we have a little bit from the college scene. We do here. Washington was beaten by Arizona State 13-7. That was that score. And let's see what else we find here. Poor old Auburn was destroyed. Anyway, that was we were just talking about LSU. Auburn 23-27 by LSU, finding magic in a win over Auburn. So there we go. That's the country people in Alabama. And the big deal there about Judge Moore and company. He's part of the Crimson Tide. That's the quote-unquote city gang, as opposed to the country people from Auburn. Auburn is, I guess you'd call it, the state university there. This is kind of interesting here. An ex-Green Beret, Nat Boyer, I suppose, writes an open letter to Colin Kaepernick, and won't go into all of it, but we're trying to get the highlights of it here. Every single American, including President DJ Trump, Colin Kaepernick, and my brothers in arms overseas, are wondering what in the hell is going on back there. I'm sitting in the same chair in the same apartment that I sat in almost 4 years ago when I wrote an open letter to Colin Kaepernick. I was hurt when I saw him sitting on the bench during the national anthem, but I'm much more hurt now, not by him, not by where we are now with the protests, but by us simply put. Seems like we just hate each other, and that is far more painful to me than any protest or demonstration, rally, or tweet. We are told to pick a side, and there is a line to draw in the sand. Or are you with us? Are you against us? Are you just not who you are? Or at least we support. We are supposed to be. We are supposed to be better than that. We are Americans, and this doesn't even seem to be about right or about wrong. It's about right or left. It's more about right or left. Today, it feels like the nation is divided. Isn't really about the anthem or the flag or kneeling or setting or fists in the air. It's about DJ Trump. It's not about Colin Kaepernick. It's not about the military or even police brutality. It feels like it's about winning, and that makes America so great. Sheer competitiveness. We are winners, and we won't quit until victory to ours. We see sports every day. We live it. We live and die by the outcomes of our teams. The desire to win at all costs is costing us great and many of our neighbors. The winning mentality seems to have us spilled over into an obsession with being right and not willing to admit or that maybe we are very wrong. To deploy overseas, train and live with and fight alongside and ultimately defend foreigners that have little in common with is truly a challenging task. But returning home to a country that is so divided, so judgmental, so hateful of one another is almost as difficult to deal with as burying a fallen comrade. That's Nate Boyer. So he sat down with a group of combat arms and special force veterans in a roundtable discussion here, and this is interesting. Here, we'll put it on the Facebook page and the Twitter feed of what Mr. Boyer was able to do here, and I don't know if we can. if we can get anything here or not. We may not be able to get his voice in here, but he does have a voice and he does have an issue, and it is an issue about the course of the American people, and I guess it's not there. Sorry about that. But anyway, the man has definitely has something to say. He's an ex-Green Beret, writes an open letter to Trump. I doubt if Trump will look at it at all. Thus, our Crimson Tide. The Crimson Tide, was the Alabama race. The conditions in Alabama are symptomatic of much in the red states of where it is. And we move on. Incidentally, in other news here, Mr. Harvey Weinstein has been expelled from the Academy of Motion Pictures. I will only comment on his plight. It's a different plight. It's a plight of Bill Cosby in white. Effectively there, many women have come about with many stories about Mr. Weinstein. From many years ago, evidently there's an investigation in New York of something happened also many years ago. This is widespread and has been widespread in Hollywood. We did a special on the founder and the playboy of philosophy there, and what went on in Hollywood, but not only in Hollywood. It's at Fox News. It's all over the place, particularly with men of a certain age. Harvey Weinstein's around my age, close to it, 65 or so. We see that out there with those. We've seen the same thing with Old Man Ailes as more of a right, literally the way he saw it. And over at Fox News there, the flocked one over there, name him slips my... Used to see him all the time. He hasn't been around in a while. But, I mean, the list goes longer and longer and longer. And in Hollywood, it's interesting there. Everyone there knew about Weinstein. But no one said anything. So when the opening comes, what happens to him? They throw him out of the Academy of Motion Pictures, the Oscar people, without addressing the problems with Oscar. But at the same time, his wife leaves him. I mean, everything goes there. The people in France are taking back one of their medals. I mean, this whole thing, it's sort of like what happened to Bill Cosby. Colleges were giving back scholarships. Memorials that were put up for Bill Cosby were taken out. And Bill Cosby's trial is not even finished. So in other words, Harvey Weinstein has not had a trial yet. That's the most important thing there. You have anecdotal evidence there. I don't know if anyone has got a picture of him or any statements where he's admitted doing any of these things. Don't know. But evidently some trials will come. Some civil things will happen. And Gloria Allred, evidently, one of the big Weinstein backers, her daughter Bloom, was an advisor. I guess she got shamed and had to quit. But she was one of the talking heads against Bill Cosby. So this is a double standard here. And we've talked about these side issues before. And what happens when you get into this persecution of an African American like Bill Cosby or the All-American hero Orenthal James Simpson, it then reverberates. And now it's into Harvey Weinstein and his production studio. Others will fall also. Before this is over, we'll start to be judged there. Evidently he was in the massage racket. Supposedly... getting massages from various actresses on the scene. And then, I don't know, some claim that he assaulted them, but years ago. But you see, the problem with assault charges, and we've been involved in rape cases, the problem with assault charges is the older they are, the less you have in terms of evidence. Records are lost. If there were hotel rooms involved, if there were private homes, well, there's no record. There were no rape tests given, and many times no medical records at all. Just the victim saying it, and perhaps sometimes there's a conversation the victim had with other people. We don't know. But those cases are there. Was there any police report, or just now there's a police report? It's very, very difficult from a criminal standpoint to sustain that kind of a case. Even we had a case with football players in Minnesota where they were expelled, held up to public ridicule, tried to charge them with felony assault charges. The DA there passed on those charges, and then they tried to reinvigorate or reinvent the charges by going back a second time. The police did not file a criminal case there. This stuff is very, very dicey. It's very difficult to convict. Now, if you have a situation where someone, even cases, I remember upstate New York now, Dr. Sharp was involved there, where the lady had reported being raped by a state policeman, but later committed suicide. But that was all anecdotal information. The prosecutors and people that had been accused of misconduct sued Dr. Sharpton, and Dr. Sharpton and two attorneys. Some of them settled. Dr. Sharpton had to settle the case. So this situation gets very, very dicey. There was an article I saw the other day while some policeman, where the hell was that, in Minneapolis was suing the mayor for calling him a racist. Of course, he'll have to demonstrate his trial he's not a racist. It's going to be very difficult to do. So these are the kinds of things, period, we get from the Taliban. They deny a former hostage claim of murder and rape. This hostage claims that his child was murdered and his wife was raped. Well, we don't know. So we have all these kinds of situations coming up here. We'll see you on the Monday Morning Quarterback on many of these channels. This is from the Washington Post. The timing of Trump's healthcare action couldn't be worse. And no doubt about that. We'll get together a healthcare program. Violence, threats, bragging, Harvey Weinstein's 30-year pattern of abuse in Hollywood. So now it's all out here. He's been at it for 30 years, they claim, so I don't know. But in terms of where he is, he doesn't want to put out there that too much bragging, especially on any tape. But, here we go. Out here, I'll just start this out. In 1984, he was 32 years old, making one of his first real feature films outside of Stratton, Pennsylvania. It was called Playing for Keeps. One day, a young female crew member came to office of the lead producer. Now, this is what an old high school friend of Harvey's from Queens. Oh, okay, he's from Queens. Anyway, he asked her to come to his hotel room, ostensibly for work reasons, and then he kissed her. She resisted. He overpowered her and forced her on the bed and attempted to a little sex on her. As Mr. Muhammad would say, the Honorable Elijah Muhammad, what do you have, freakiness or whatever. Anyway, all these things now come out here. If she filed a police report, another crew member heard the woman's account separately at the time and collaborates it. This is what we were talking about earlier. No, she said, shaking, she just wanted to keep her job. Okay, so she didn't file a police report, but she did tell someone about it, and that's usually what, the situation is. So you'll hear these kinds of things come out here, and he's now 65, and all these things are popping out here, and you'll have various people. The setter, one of his accusers, said that she heard before she met him that he could be lewd. And she didn't know to what extent. She was compelled to meet him anyway. So she met him. She said she found herself fending off his advances as he physically overpowered her in the hotel room during the 2008 Sundance Film Festival. Anyway. So this is the whole nude story. We'll put it up here. You can read it. This will do it for us. Have a good weekend, everyone. We'll see you on the Monday Morning Quarterback. And there's a numbers man somewhere appearing around here. That's our financial program. We'll look at a little bit. We'll look at Amazon. They filed their request for proposal. Incidentally, if it's due in this week for cities that want to get into it. And the people at Moody's did an intensive model on this. We'll talk a little bit about it and some more numbers in the news. Tesla has done some layoffs. We reported on that earlier.